So there you go. Polly, you're up.
Sorry, I was mute.
No, yeah, it was my fault. You're on, man. We're gonna be live for less than 10 more minutes. Then whoever wants to hang out offline, that's fine. But
Okay. Um, yeah, I was just wondering because, um, this is a kind of a big topic for me. Like something that I've been interested in is the whole issue of um, Christians using the Bible to justify various things. And one of the ones that I've been very interested in recently is slavery. And I've been reading a lot about how I'm an African American. Um, and while my ancestors weren't slaves, they were immigrants. I know some black people whose ancestors were. Um, and it's interesting because Christians, in the South, they used the Bible, pointed to the Bible in justification for slavery, and they saw the non-slave holding states as, the godless, or rather secular, um, laid back Christians who weren't, really committed to their theology. So I'm just wondering your thoughts on that because, I mean, they also use the same Bible.
Yeah, hold on, let me clear my throat here, sorry. All right, the slavery of the 1800s is not the same thing as the slavery of the Old Testament. There's differences. There's some similarities and there's some differences. And just because people used the Bible to justify slavery in the modern context doesn't mean that the Bible's not correct. It does mean that they were misusing it. And incidentally, it was the Christians who primarily worked against slavery here in America.
In the North.
In the North, yes, that's true. And it's true that a lot of Christians were using slavery in the Old Testament to justify it, and that's just wrong. So, biblically, the Bible acknowledges slave status as a property of the master. That's Exodus 21. The Bible
And in
restricts.
Colossians.
Yep. Yes, it did, because that was the context. We'll talk about that. The Bible restricted the master's power over the slave. The slave was a member of the master's household. The slave was required to rest on the Sabbath. He could participate in religious observances.
Yes.
Prohibition of extradition of slaves granted him asylum. The servitude of a Hebrew debt slave was limited to 6 years. When a slave was freed, he was to receive gifts that enabled him to survive economically. Now, there are similarities and there are dissimilarities with what happened in the 1800s. And from
Well,
what
I
I
mean, part
understand,
of it, there is overlap. Sorry to
there is.
interrupt, but there is
Absolutely is, yeah.
overlap. In fact, that's actually how a lot of African Americans became religious, by attending the services of the master, who would sometimes either be a member of the clergy of that particular parish or county, and then it was seen as a break from the hard work in the fields that they had to endure.
Right. Yeah, and, you know, well, let's look at the cultural context. I'm not trying to justify slavery, but the reality is there was this. I believe it's called the Apodictic Law, an eye for an eye and tooth for a tooth.
Yep.
There was a phenomenon in the Old Testament times in the Middle East area called blood revenge. So let's say I hit you and broke your tooth. Your brother doesn't like that. He comes and breaks my arm. My brother doesn't like that. Comes and kills your brother. Your family comes, and then we get this war. It just escalates. So blood revenge was that problem, and the Apodictic Law was given an eye for an eye. In other words, to stop it. The question is, why didn't God just say forgive and forget and go away? Because he demands things of people, but they don't listen to him. He put a law in place. At least you guys can stop here. Could God have changed people's hearts? Yeah, but we get into the theology of election, predestination, sovereignty, and it gets complicated. But the thing is, God, we see in the Old Testament a principle of God working with the failures of man, inside the failures of men, in their culture, in their societies, and restricting certain levels of badness, stopping it more and more. In cases of some cultures, he wiped them out, like the killing of the babies with Moloch and things like that, the Canaanites. So, slavery. He allowed it to continue even in the New Testament time.
Right, right, which is what I'm reading. I'm actually reading as you're speaking to me. There was actually a sermon given by someone justifying slavery on the basis of the New Testament.
Right. And they could make a case for that. But what they're missing is that Jesus didn't come here to remove slavery. He came here to
Okay,
atone for sin. What would
obviously.
happen? What would happen if we made disciples of every nation? Slavery will go away.
But would it? Because
Yes.
many of the masters had Christianity, practiced by their slaves as well, and they were able to be slave and Christian and master concurrently.
Yep.
So it wasn't until the Civil War. I mean, this is. Are you
But
saying
let
that?
me address that. Yes, they were, because they were culturally indoctrinated to accept slavery. It takes generations sometimes for this to go away. So they were culturally indoctrinated. There were accounts of a master uh, he would have a slave, and they would go to church, and the
Of
slave
course.
was an elder, and the master was submitted to things like that. And yet there was still this economic social structure of slavery. But the point is that
But that's a more of
eventually
a rarity. Sorry, that's
it
more of a
was.
rarity.
It
Yeah, because
was.
they weren't allowed to read.
Yeah.
They- so
Well, actually, some of the slaves were, because you go to Galatians 3:24, the law is a tutor that leads us to Christ. A tutor was often a slave in the house who had the ability to read and write and was given the responsibility of raising the children for the master, and that was a slave. Not all were slaves, but that it was a thing. See, I suspect, this is just my opinion, okay? I suspect that in the making of the disciples, what's going to happen is things are just going to get more biblically sound, and people are going to get rid of things like slavery and
but
prostitution and drug use if we're doing our job.
but but
If I
but your God. Sorry, but
Wait a minute, your God?
sorry, God in the Bible, as you
Wait, wait,
see
wait,
it.
wait, wait. I'm curious. What are you, an atheist or what?
I'm an atheist.
Okay, all right.
Yeah. So he condemns prostitution, but not slavery. In Romans, or sorry, Corinthians, I think, First Corinthians, it says that the prostitute, nor the liar, nor the drunkard, nor the homosexual, depending on your translation, will enter the kingdom of heaven. But it doesn't. I mean, it doesn't absolutely repudiate slavery in that sense. So, I mean, what are the priorities in regards to this theology that it will repudiate, drunkenness, but not slavery? Um,
Drunkenness is a more vile, more harmful, immediate issue. Slavery was often allowed in the culture for various reasons. You have two countries that would war against each other. The losing country would be devastated economically, agriculturally. The men usually would be wiped out. So if the country was left to um, to just fend for itself, be starvation and plague. So often the victor country would take the populace as slaves, move them into their homes, and make them indentured servants. It was not the best situation, but it was one of the solutions to not letting an entire nation die in just abject poverty and famine. Usually the warriors, the victors, you know, when they're done fighting, people have compassion, and so they would get them to be slaves. And in the Hebrew culture, this was allowed because certain people would have certain debts that they would have to pay, and they couldn't. They would go into indentured servitude. And then there was what's called a doulos. Uh, a doulos is a slave that wanted to be a slave, and he would have, I believe, his right earlobe pegged to the door.
with an
And
all, yeah.
with an all. And so there's different kinds of slavery. I'm not an expert in this, but there are different kinds and different levels of it in the Old Testament. But gradually you see that they obtain more and more rights as the Jewish system increased, and slavery became almost a profession to some area. So when it's spoken about that in the New Testament, it's not the slavery of the 1800s kind of a thing. Yes, a lot of times they were considered property, but
They
they
were
also,
considered property, yes.
yeah, a lot of times they were, a lot of times they weren't, but they were often considered property, but they also were entrusted to raise their children as tutors. They would often be adopted. They were often seen as sons, and things. It's a different kind of a culture.
Is that why they could be beaten?
Well, that was the Old Testament, but not in the New
No,
Testament.
no, but I mean, they.
And I don't know the context of those in the Old Testament. Sorry, in that context, I don't know.
No, I mean, the Old Testament says that you can hit them or beat them, and many of the Confederates in the South. I mean, the South declared itself as uniquely Christian in reaction. If you read the Constitution of the Confederacy, it declared itself as, set apart or ordained by Almighty God. This was the words of Jefferson Davis in a reaction to a more secularized North that didn't have God as its providence in government, and that's why that's one of the ways in which they distinguish the North non-slave holding states from the Southern slave holding states, is that they were sort of more lax in their views about what the Bible said regarding slavery.
Yeah, they were lax in the South, because think about it, how the slaves were captured, what was done to them. It was inhumane. That would never have been allowed in the Old Testament times that way, from what I understand. It would never have been allowed. And yet, unfortunately, the white Christians were profiting from this.
But it says that you can sell them, does it not? It says that in Leviticus 27, that women are half price of the men, and that you can sell them. And I mean,
they were considered property. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, and so were many of the blacks of the South. And it seems that I would think that
Well, is it wrong?
I mean, I would say, I wasn't here to talk about objective morality, but it's just interesting how the same Bible you're using to condemn homosexuals is the same Bible that the white Christians used numerous times in order to support their views on slavery.
Yeah.
And I mean, I just find it sad that
Did all Christians do that, though?
No, but those who were seen as sort of, in a sense, lax in their theology.
So, who fought to free the slaves?
The North.
White people.
Christians.
Right? And
Christians,
did they not?
But they were foregoing their religion in order to do so. That's why the South declared itself as uniquely Christian, is what I'm saying.
Well, the North had Christian men who knew that it was wrong, who also went in to fight and gave their lives to free the black slaves as well, because a lot of Christian men in the North thought that it was wrong, morally wrong for that, and based on the scriptures. Now what are you going to do? Why are you only picking one side of this issue?
Well, I mean, it's the same, but they were seen the same way as you would see the Christians who, for example, support gay marriage.
Well, wait a minute. Why are you only bringing up one side of this?
Because I'm saying that your views
you're black?
No, because I'm bringing up the fact that your views on this are analogous to the Christians who use the Bible for a malicious purpose.
People can use the Bible, the Quran, they can use a cookbook the way they want for malicious purposes. It doesn't mean that the book itself is bad.
But I'm saying that I see you as doing the exact same thing.
Okay. Doing what? What am I doing?
Using the Bible to condemn homosexuals and gay marriage.
Gay marriage is immoral because God has said it is.
But your God has also said that slaves should submit to their masters.
Yes, and they should.
So the black slaves should have...
Didn't say black slaves in the Bible, did it?
No, I'm just saying the slaves of the South in particular, who happen to be black.
Wait a minute. You said the Bible. The Bible just says slaves. So which kind of slave was it talking about when it said submit? They're white slaves, right?
There were white slaves in the Greek
context.
It doesn't specify in the New Testament whether they were indentured servants or not. That's in the Old Testament, and that's only for enslaving your fellow Jews.
There were some that had to be because they had to pay off debts. Not that that made it okay, but that's what the system was. Was that system wrong?
I would say actually yes, because there's no guarantee that he'll actually be able to pay off the debt, and that you could trick the slave
But the
into.
Jews, if it was a Jew, they were after 6 years, they were automatically released. The debt
But
was
those are only for your fellow Jews. It says that you can enslave from the heathen around you in Leviticus 25:44 through 46.
okay. So you've obviously studied this quite a bit. It's really important to you, isn't it?
Well, yes, because I'm baffled as to how so many black people, I mean, as an African American, can embrace Christianity. And I've had this conversation with black Christians before. I'm not just picking on you, but black Christians and black Muslims who, both religions were involved in the slavery of Africans. In North Africa, you had
I
the
get
Arab
that.
slave trade.
So
And
is this why you reject? Okay, so you want to know why I can say homosexuality is a sin? Because Romans chapter 1, 26 to 28 says so. 1 Corinthians 6:9 says so. Okay, it's a sin.
okay, and couldn't
Slavery is not said to be a sin.
correct. So
Okay,
your God
now
condemns
what do we do?
homosexuality, but not slavery.
Okay, so what about it?
So I'm wondering, what should the slaves of the South have submitted to their masters?
Yes, they should have.
Okay, now given that, why should we have? So you're saying that those in the South who, I mean, not all of them went to fight for the North, but those who fled to the, attempted to flee to the North, like Harriet Tubman trying to go to the Mason-Dixon line, she was in the wrong for doing so. She was escaping.
I don't know her situation, so I can't tell you. I don't know the situation that she was in. The generic principle is that a slave should submit to the master.
So
Yes.
the runaways were
And
in the wrong. So the
I
runaway
don't know.
slaves
I
were
can
not.
tell you. I'll tell you again. I don't know their particular circumstances, so I can't answer on that.
Can I respond?
Sure.
I've been in this conversation many times with atheists, and again, I'm called the racist because I'm a black man, and I say that the majority of atheists that get into these conversations with me are white, and they immediately try to turn it around on me and make it look like I'm a racist. So it's good that I'm talking to another black man about this issue. Okay, so you can't call me a racist for saying that.
Of course not.
But anyway, the fact of the matter is, your question, I see the slavery issue in the same way that I see Rahab the harlot being praised and recognized in the Hebrews Hall of Faith in Hebrews 11. What did she do? What was she praised for? She was praised for telling a lie. But wait a minute, wait, isn't that against God? Well, of course. But look what she did it for. She did it for the purpose of saving somebody. She didn't do it for the purpose that was against God. See, when God tells us to do something like, for instance, don't practice revenge, okay, why does he tell us to do that? Because we have a different motive for practicing revenge than he does. That's why he says, do not practice revenge. Revenge belongs only to him. In the same way, this is why I personally believe, and somebody could correct me, about the issue with Rahab being recognized in the Hebrew Hall of Faith, because she lied for what reason? To protect two men of God. So in the same way, I can look at Harriet Tubman and saying that what she did was a righteous thing because, again, as Matt pointed out already, the slavery that was practiced here in the United States is vastly different than what God condoned in the Old Testament. Okay? So there's no problem with that. I, as a black man, can say that it was no problem with Harriet Tubman freeing, participating in the Underground Railroad and freeing the slaves. She was not doing anything contrary to God.
No, but how is it? Can you explain the distinctions between the slavery of the South and just the slavery described in the Bible?
I think Matt did that already.
Okay.
No, but you said.
Let me jump in. Let me jump in.
Okay.
No. Let me jump in because we're going to take this offline because for no other purpose other than I have to end it because I have to get up very early in the morning. So I'm going to give Matt Slick a last word. And guys that are in the Hangout, I gave quite a few of you controls so that when people enter, when we're offline, you can add them to the broadcast so that they can engage with everybody who sticks around. So, Matt, did you want to say some last words on slavery before we wrap this up?
Sure. There, it's a difficult issue to kind of get through all the particulars, and I'm not an expert study on this. But there, just as Veckel was saying, and I already tried to point out earlier, the slavery that happened in the 1800s was different than that of the Old Testament. And Christians on both sides try to use the Bible to justify things. But when we make disciples of all nations, things like this are going to disappear, because to make a disciple of all nations means that we're going to treat them as equals to ourselves, and slavery doesn't fit in that. God allowed it for economic reasons, and he allowed people to do things, just as he allows people to sin for various reasons. But when we make disciples, these kind of things go away. But if you're an atheist, you can not like that slavery happened, but it's not an issue of morality with an atheist. It's just an issue of you don't like it. If you want to argue that something is right or wrong, you have to assume the Christian perspective, and that refutes your own atheism, then you're being inconsistent. So we could have some interesting discussions on this at another time in more depth, but I actually really like this conversation with I forgot his name, because he's a black guy, he's articulate, he's intelligent, asking good questions. And then Beckel's right here. This is something I think should be talked about more. I'd like to have more discussions on this, work through some of the details. I value it.
All right. We will continue off air for everybody who watched. I appreciate it. Next week, same time, same place. And for more information on Matt Slick, go to carm.org and like him on Facebook. Matt Slick, you have almost 45,000 likes on Facebook. Did you even know that?
Yeah, I just saw that yesterday, as a matter of fact. We're going to celebrate when we get 50. We'll just probably say, woohoo, and then we'll go on.
I just saw that today, and I thought that was pretty cool. So, yeah. And,
does anybody know how to get our YouTube videos unlocked? Google did a combo thing. We are locked out of our own video account. So if anybody knows about that, let me know. But at any rate, I just had to say that. It popped into my head.
I'm sure some of the guys that are in here can help you out because they have YouTube channels. So.
Okay.
All right. Until next time, everybody, take care and God bless.
Slavery apologist.